How's it going, guys? This is Rio Murata, photographer based in Tokyo. So yeah, I was planning on making a different video, but it started raining this whole week, and my sort of plan got screwed over, unfortunately. But a lot of my friends and a lot of my viewers have been commenting like, why do I use the GW690? And even my friends thought it, why do you use GW690? Are you like love struck or something like that? And are you crazy, kind of? And I said, no, I just enjoy using the GW690. And I thought I should make a video on this topic. So instead of just talking about the GW690, I'm going to be talking about my reasons for using the GW690 Mark III and for medium format, why I use the Nikon F3 for 35mm SLR, and why I use Fujifilm for digital, to clarify those questions for you guys. This is going to be super long, so I split it up in 3 sections. Section 1, why I use a GW690 Mark III as my main film camera. Part 2, why do I use Nikon F3 as my main 35mm camera. And part 3, why do I use Fujifilm for my digital work, so my YouTube and my BTS, product photography and stuff like that. Why do I use that? So yeah, let's begin the journey. So GW690, it's really intriguing because this camera, apparently, I said it over and over again, I found it in Camera Kitamura's Shashinki shop in downtown Tokyo, actually their flagship camera shop, which they sell both digital and film cameras. This camera in particular was being sold right beside the Pentax 6.7, which I initially was going to purchase, but it caught my attention because it is comparably completely different from the Pentax 6.7. You guys probably know it. The GW690 is a rangefinder, meaning that there is no pentaprism, which means that it is lighter, easier to travel with. And this is actually something that I was looking for because I wanted a camera to travel with. And you guys know the Pentax 6.7 is a monster in a league of its own. And in my case, this camera, the GW690, sort of caught my attention due to the fact that one is it has a fixed lens mounted onto this camera, meaning that I don't have to think of deciding on what kind of lenses I should bring with that camera system, because if I purchase this Pentax 6.7, there's like a lot of options available. There's a 105mm lens, there's the 60-70mm lens, and there's also a wide angle lens and stuff like that. And I just wanted a camera that I could get my piece out of my sort of like mind, so I don't have to like go into that problem with deciding what like lens to go for. So I picked up the GW690, and also the shape is easier to like hold, manage, and also the weight wise, it was the perfect choice back 3-4 years ago, so I went with the GW690. And there is this sort of like pros and cons debate going on of having that fixed lens. And I took that as a positive due to the fact that you can learn so much if you have more limitations. And that's a lot of photographers, famous people say that. This camera has a lot of limitations, but overcoming those limitations, you can learn a lot from it, the strengths and weaknesses. And if you can utilize that, if you're a professional, you can utilize almost any kind of camera, if I'm right. So yeah, and the GW690, interesting enough, I think before they released the GW series, they had the GL series, which used to be interchangeable, but I guess the marketing and the engineers realized that if they make it interchangeable back in the days, the durability, reliability went down the drain from their, I guess, R&D department, and they realized that if they make it fixed, if they fix that lens onto the camera itself, slap it onto camera and make it so that you can't remove it, because there's less parts used in manufacturing that camera, you would have less sort of like damages or less like defects along the course of the years to come. So I guess that's like one of the reasons they went with this route. And yeah, and some people loved it, some people hate it, but I actually enjoy this camera because you're stuck with just one lens and that's it. And also for the price wise, because it's fixed and there's only that lens attached to it, you don't have to pay extra for purchasing a specific type of lens. If you're using a Pentax system, you have to purchase you might have to purchase a wide angle, and then after that maybe a telephoto and stuff like that, and that cost adds up in the long run. So I went with the GW690. And another reason is this rangefinder that I just said earlier. Because it is a rangefinder, it means that there's no pentaprism, meaning that that area is shaved off, and it's actually easier to travel, easier to pack that camera in a bag, because typically bags are rectangular, hopefully. And if you have a camera like the Pentax 67, which has this like something protruding out, sounds wrong, but it's harder to sort of like fit that in a bag and stuff like that. So that's actually another reason I went with the GW690. Also, not to mention the 8 shots per exposures, people take that as a negative. I take that as a positive along the course of the years I've shot with, due to the fact that the great thing about medium format cameras is that it kind of sort of like, it's hard to explain, but it kind of sort of like can accommodate any type of photographer that has some specific use in terms of how much risk you are ready to take on, because we all know that if we shoot one exposure, we're basically burning cash. But it depends on what format we're using. 35mm, we have 24 exposures and 36 exposures. Medium format cameras, you have 4 choices. You have the 645, which shoots 15 exposures. 6x6 Hasselblad shoot 12 exposures. The 6x7 Pentax 67 Mamiya 7 shoots 10 exposures, and we have the 6x9 which shoots 8 exposures. So this is sort of like, relatively speaking, how much risk you're wanting to take. If you want to take a lot of risk when shooting with your film camera, chances are you're going to pick up the 645 because you have more exposures. The opposite is true, vice versa. If you shoot with a 6x9, the Fuji GW690, you have less exposures, which means that if you fail on one specific shot, that is an ouchie in the leg, arrow in the knee or something, I don't know. But it's sort of like how much, and the middle would be like 6x7, which you can basically take some risks by taking a couple of vertical or maybe even like horizontal shots if you don't know which composition would fit your bills. But GW690 kind of taught me that you have a lot of risk at your hand when you're shooting with it because you have less exposures, and I know that is a negative, but at the same time, because there's less exposures, we have to think much more carefully compared to like shooting with 645, which have double the exposures. And I know that by understanding the lighting conditions, where the the sun is hitting on our faces or on our subjects and stuff like that, we can sort of like understand whether or not if that shot is worth taking or not. And it's sort of like a step backwards and forwards at the same time, because if we understand more about the composition, if we understand more about where the lighting condition is, if it's cloudy, if it's sunny, or is the sun gonna come out, or if it's like daytime, early in the morning, or dusk and stuff like that, I guess in the long run we can learn so much from that. And that's actually one of the reasons why I still use this camera up until today. So yeah, that's basically it. But in addition to that, the reason why I use this camera is the price actually. And obviously the price did increase over the course of the year, but when you compare it with the initial price when the GW690 was initially released 40 years ago in 1980 or 1970, the GW690, when it first came out, cost roughly 163,500 yen, and converting inflation, and because our annual income increased over the course of the years, that's roughly 300,000 yen in today's world, which is roughly $2,500 cha-ching, or $2,300 converting the forex exchange rate. But right now, as of 2023, this camera still costs around $1,000, which is still the half the price of when it was actually released. But when you compare it with the time when I purchased it, the actual price actually doubled. So it's hard to explain or hard to say this, but when you compare it with other medium format cameras, this camera is actually probably the cheapest and the most sort of like reliable. I'm not sure if that's the right word or not, but the most affordable and I guess usable camera in the medium format department, because we all know the Mamiya 7 Pentax 6.7 actually increased tri-folded, quad-folded over the course of this decade or so, if I'm right. So, I mean, if this camera breaks down, I could pick up another one. So, yeah. But because it's sort of like a fully mechanical camera, I know that it's going to last pretty long before it breaks down. I'm still on 300. It's on the 330th roll of film. It's going so strong, and I still enjoy using this camera. So that's basically the reasons why I use this camera up until today. Okay, so part 2. So the main reason why I use the Nikon F3 for 35mm SLR camera system is, unfortunately, I don't use it often, but I use it as sort of like a semi-backup to my medium format camera. And also another reasons why I have this camera in particular is, my main reason is I used to be a user of the Nikon system ecosystem. I used to use Nikon's like DSLR system back in the days, and because of that knowledge, I know typically AIS's lens, the prime lenses that Nikon manufactured before they went into digital, and also because I live in Tokyo, Japan, which there's a lot of film cameras, a lot of lenses. There are far greater number of Nikon lenses available in Tokyo compared to other manufacturers such as Canon and Pentax and other random manufacturers, unfortunately. But in addition to that, Nikon has sort of like a wide array of lens lineup. When they were producing film cameras, they have the AI lenses, the AIS lenses, and various focal lengths that cover that whole range, like 20mm, 24mm, 28mm, 35mm. They have a pancake 50mm lens that I use. They have a 55 AIS macro, 60mm 85, and a 105, 135. I basically understand their system extensively, so that's actually one of the reasons why I use a Nikon F3. I initially used to use a Nikon FM10 camera, but it broke down on me, and it taught me a valuable lesson of not buying the cheapest camera. And initially, after my FM10 broke down, I thought of getting the FM2, which wasn't overpriced right now as of 2020. And then I looked later to find a used nice version of the Nikon F3, purchased that at an affordable price of roughly $200. I think right now it costs $300, which is another reason why I purchased this camera in particular, which is the price. And interesting enough, Nikon's F3 type of camera system is still actually in the affordable zone, in my opinion, my honest opinion, because the price probably only increased by $100 or maybe $120 over the course of this 5 years or so, ever since I purchased mine version. And it's, when you look in the long term of horizon, the Nikon F3 actually is a really reputable camera due to the fact that one major reason that I purchased it is serviceability. And Nikon frequently does these sort of like film camera only maintenance type of service available in Tokyo. Actually, they do it once per year or maybe once per 2 years or so. They do it routinely, and I never sent my camera out to like service. Unfortunately, it never broke down on me, but having that sort of assurance that they can sort of fix it as long as they have that, the parts available, it is possible. And this has been sort of like a workhorse, sort of like a dedicated professional camera that a lot of press photographers used back in the days. And it is a reliable camera that I will sort of bring to my graveyard if I die, so if I break down. I don't know, so yeah. And another reason is obviously it is a mechanical camera, meaning that the shutter is mechanical, meaning that Typically, mechanical cameras are easier to fix because it uses some kind of physical parts. It uses a physical spring or something like that, which is easier to manage, easier to sort of like fix, typically speaking, compared to electronic type of shutter mechanisms. So Nikon made some electronic shutter type of cameras, such as a Nikon FG series. I'm not sure if their E series was like electronic shutter, but they had a couple of mechanical type, not mechanical, electronic shutter system similar to Mamiya's system. Actually, Mamiya 645 uses electronic shutter. Famous RZ67 uses electronic shutter. If it breaks down, typically you can't fix it because those semiconductors, so they're what I call electronic type of parts are not being manufactured, so it's harder to fix, or mostly in most cases it's impossible to fix. So that's why I typically try to use cameras that are mechanical, fully mechanical. GW690 is mechanical, Nikon F3 is mechanical, except for the light meter, it is battery operated. And yeah, that's basically the reason why I use the Nikon F3. It is durable, like a tank, and it never breaks at all. Although it is really heavy, but I think it's worth the investment if you like to shoot with a film camera. And we all know that film cameras, the price will eventually increase over the course of the year, and because we know that, it might be a safer bet to just have one maybe in our dry cabinet, and maybe in the future we might be shooting with more film, but the cameras already being bought and sold by bought by so many people that there are no any more like stocks available. That could happen in the future, so I just, for investment purposes, purchased a 35, but Nikon F3, but I still enjoy shooting with it when I find eccentric looking film stocks. And yeah, and it's like really pleasing to look at actually. So So yeah, last but not least is digital, and this is going to be the longest video part ever, actually part 3, because I never talked about it unfortunately, but I have to make this video because a lot of my friends want to understand why I use the Fujifilm system. So yeah, interesting to know. Before going to that topic directly, I need to explain my background information for you guys because you don't know what kind of camera I used back in the days. So we all know that back in 2000, year 2000, that was sort of like the tipping point in the, I guess, camera industry, because camera manufacturers were shifting away from film to digital due to the fact that we all know Sony created the CMOS sensor, which can capture images, and because the LCD of our camera screens got, I guess they were able to manage to pull it off by making a sort of like a significant portion of that, screen available for preview. I guess that was a technological advancement in the photography community, and companies such as Nikon and Canon started to produce their own sort of like digital cameras, APS-C size cameras, and along with that, as time passed, they were able to pull off by creating Sony was able to bring out the 35mm full size, full frame CMOS sensors, which became the full frame type of cameras. And I myself used to use the Nikon D800, D810 back in the days 2012, 2014. And this is sort of like a story where I guess 2010 to 2016, 2017 or so, camera companies started to sort of like go against each other by making more megapixel count within their not mirrorless, but more like their DSLR types of cameras. The D810, D850, which had 30, 40 megapixels, was gaining traction, and there was this sort of trend going on, 5D Mark IV and stuff like that from Canon. And as that sort of like hurricane was brewing, I myself, as a photographer, realized that I don't need that much megapixels. And the most cases where you need the megapixels is if you're like printing big ass prints, and typically we all know that we don't print much as we used to. And back in the days I did not print much, and I realized there was no need to do that because things were going into digital. Web ads don't need that much resolutions and stuff like that. So I realized later that I had D810, D850 is going to be overkill, and I started looking for other brands that had lower sort of like megapixel counts, and unfortunately Nikon was going in that direction, and I predict that they were going non-stop in that direction. And I realized that Fujifilm was coming along on the mirrorless bandwagon, going after Sony if I'm right, and they were producing relatively smaller size sensors type of cameras, their APS-C type of cameras, their X series, which was gaining traction due to the fact that although it is a smaller sensor size, they were able to like cram it into a smaller footprint. And they released XT1, which got so much backlash. XT2 they improved, but not too much. XT3, and I realized after the XT3 that was sort of like a turning point in the mirrorless history, because they were able to like increase the autofocus capabilities, they were able to increase the megapixel count along with more like, I guess, reliabilities, if that's a word. And that was sort of like the turnaround in my camera history, where I hopped from DSLR to mirrorless camera. And interesting enough, I still use the XT3 up until now as a sort of like a photography type of camera, and it's actually really useful in my opinion. And there's a lot of reasons why I went with Fujifilm. One is that megapixel count. They don't have that much megapixels within their camera, meaning that the file sizes is actually manageable. And this is sort of like a trade-off. The larger the megapixel count, typically the file sizes will get bigger, which also means that if the file size gets bigger, it's going to tax on your computer system, because in order to get those preview images on any kind of like photo editing app, Photoshop or I use Capture One, it takes more time to load those preview images into your computer. And if you don't like that to happen, you basically have to upgrade your computer. That becomes expensive, and at the same time you basically have to invest in a larger storage system, which is another burden on your wallet. My wallet's on fire. And that's actually one of the reasons why I went with Fujifilm, because they had smaller megapixels, so I can basically manage my photos much more easily across my system. And another reason is because, like I said, they use a smaller crop size sensor. They were able to sort of like cram in a lot of stuff in a small footprint, which equates to being able to being sort of like mobile. You can basically take your camera in your bag and take it out from your bag. And this is sort of like the most important part for me, because if you can't get the shot, even if you have a large ass camera, I said ass camera, if you have a big ass camera, and if you can't get the shot, what's the purpose of having that large camera? And I typically wanted a smaller camera. I used to use DSLRs, but I realized on that problem. And unless if I'm shooting in a studio environment when I'm not moving much, DSLR still works perfectly. But in most cases, when I'm shooting outside and stuff like that, a smaller camera is much more manageable. It's much more flexible, and it's like easier to use. I think that is king of the hills, so I went with Fujifilm. And another reason I went with Fujifilm is basically the price, actually. So when you compare it with full frame alternatives such as, I guess, Canon, Sony, and Nikon, if you look at the price, the retail price, it is really expensive. And APS-C counterparts from Fujifilm, there is an exception right now, because the recent cameras from Fujifilm, the X-T5, X-H2S, X-H2, in my mind, looks really rather overpriced in my opinion when you put it side by side with full frame counterparts. But when you look one generation or maybe two generations before that, so X-T3, X-T4, the previous cameras are really affordable. I mean, you can get one for roughly $1,000 or so. And even back in the days, a lot of professionals still use X-T3 as their main camera. X-T4, if you're doing video work and stuff like that, it is really cheap when you compare it with full frame alternatives. And when you factor in the total price of that package, as in lens selections and stuff like that, full frame is actually gonna burn double both of your pockets, your rear pockets actually, because the lenses for full frame is much more expensive due to the fact that in order to cover that whole full frame sensor, you need larger glass. In order to use larger glass, you need to invest in a larger system, larger like manufacturing capabilities and stuff like that, and the total cost basically balloons beyond expectations. And while APS-C sensor type of cameras, because their size is smaller, the sensor size is small, meaning that the glass that you use, the lens that you use, can get smaller and it's easier to manufacture, easy to produce. Therefore, the cost typically is half the price of typical full frame counterparts. And that's actually one of the reasons I went with Fujifilm. Their lens, when you factor in the whole cost of the system, it is really manageable. And depending on what you do, you can basically shave off some costs depending on what you specific lens you need or not need. You can basically sort of like swap one for the other, and you can basically save a lot on that system. So that's actually the reason that I went with this system. And last but not least is obviously their film simulations. Unfortunately, you guys probably know I shoot my YouTube videos, my BTS, I use their color profiles, I use their eternal profiles, and I don't touch the colors much because it already looks good in my opinion, and I just enjoy that rich colors. Not too saturated or unsaturated. It's like it hits that spot and I just enjoy using it. And also what's great about the Fujifilm, this is only available for Fujifilm cameras, is that if you use this with a combination of a photo editing app called Capture One Pro, which they kind of jacked up the price unfortunately. If you shoot in the RAW profile, RAW is basically a format which is unedited, no color is added, no contrast is added to so it's sort of like a flat image. You can basically, when you put all your images shot in RAW into Capture One Pro, you can basically choose every single sort of like color profile actually that Fujifilm provides. So you can basically, in that RAW profile, you can basically swap between Velvia, Provia, Classic Neg, Classic Chrome, Eterna, Bleach Bypass, etc., within their software actually. And this is something available only on Fujifilm cameras, which is superior compared to other camera manufacturers because they don't have film simulations unfortunately. So this is a great thing because if you don't know what kind of color profile you're going to want to shoot in, mostly photos, this is available in photos, so you can basically do that and not like wander around and just shoot in JPEG in one color profile. You can basically change that after in post. So that's one of the great things about using Fujifilm cameras. You can basically change and alter the color profiles in post in Capture One Pro. Unfortunately, it's not available in Photoshop or any Adobe software, but that's actually one of the great things about using this camera system. Fortunate to say that Fujifilm increased their sort of like megapixel count on their recent cameras. The X-T5 is like 40 now, XH2 is 40, XH2S is the only viable option in my case, which only has 26 megapixels. And this gets into the nitty-gritty things, but there are pros and cons of increasing megapixel count. The pros is you get more resolution, you can basically crop the image, and you can basically print larger if you want, but I don't print that big ass prints or anything nowadays. And at the same time, because the file size is larger, it's harder to like edit, and you need a decent computer to work with along with storage and stuff like that. And the other bad thing or negative with increasing megapixel count is the ISO capabilities, meaning that a lot of people have mentioned this, and I see it with my eyes too, that compared to the X-T3, X-T4, the more recent higher megapixel cameras perform bad in low light situations. What I'm shooting right now, it will probably perform much worse in those cases, while a lower megapixel cameras would actually have cleaner image output. But that's like sort of like a trade-off that you have to make. The cameras that have lower like megapixels have cleaner images typically in low light situations, while the opposite is true, and you basically had to decide on that. So that's actually one of the things, unfortunate things I had to mention from Fujifilm, and I wish they make us like a lower count megapixel camera in the XT lineup for those people who want to shoot in low light. So yeah, went a little bit off topic, but like I said, camera's basically a tool that you use to sort of like achieve what you want, and depending on what you want to achieve, obviously your preference would change over time. And because I've started shooting video, I purchased the XT4, but I sometimes shoot photos, so I still use my XT3. So yeah, hopefully I clarified a lot of people's questions why I use the GW690, the Nikon F3, and why you should use Fujifilm's like digital systems for my YouTube channel and also my work when I'm sometimes shooting photos and stuff like that. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, happy to reply. So we will see you next time. Peace out.